So now for our featured guest. Come on up, Norm Stamper. Please give former Seattle Police Chief Norm Stamper a warm Seattle 4 welcome. It's good to have you here. I'll have you take the car seat for now. So you and I did an interview 13 years ago when I was on another station, as they say. It was a half-hour program, and the interview won an Emmy Award, and I'm pretty sure it had nothing to do with me and everything to do with who you are. So I want to start with this thought. They say that all politics is local. I think in the same way all policing is local, because who's called 911 in the room? Has everybody pretty much called 911? So when you call 911, that person who shows up to where you are, there's probably no more profound interaction that we have as human beings at that moment in time. The need that you have, the fears that you have, the danger you may be in, and that person who shows up at your door is absolutely critical to what happens next to you in life. I want to start back at the beginning. You became our police chief in 1994, is that right?
Yes.
How did you decide to become a cop, Norm?
I accompanied a friend who wanted to be a cop since he was 3 years old to the civil service testing procedure in San Diego, California. I was just going to sit under a eucalyptus tree outside the War Memorial Building and wait for him to finish his test so we could go to McDenny's and have a corned beef sandwich and a beer. And the proctor at the time said, "How about you, young man? Are you here for the police test?" I did a classic grade B movie double take and said, "No, I'm not." And maybe a quick explanation about why I wasn't there for the police test. I didn't have much use for police officers when I was a kid. A big part of it had to do with my own behavior and crossing paths with police officers at the time, which I have to, I think, acknowledge. But the long and the short of it is, she talked me into coming in, taking the test. In those days, you could take it. If you passed it, they'd give you the application packet, and that's what happened. So I passed the test. My friend, who wanted to be a cop since he was 3, failed it. And later, he became a police officer in another jurisdiction. So it truly was an accident. I stood at a full-length mirror in my apartment in National City, California, thinking, what have I done, as I tried on the San Diego Police Department uniform. But I've had no regrets whatsoever since then.
Yeah. So as a young officer, you said that you became the kind of cop that everybody hates. You said that the power went to your head and you started acting like someone that you had never intended to act like. Take me through who that Norm Stamper was.
I was playing in a rhythm and blues band on the weekends and working at the National City Pet Hospital when I took the police test. So you can see I had all qualifications for becoming a cop. And one day, our rhythm and blues band was rehearsing, and a couple of police officers showed up. It was a Sunday afternoon. Every one of us knew exactly why they were there, and we were making noises to the effect that we'll tone it down, so on and so forth. The officer who did the talking of the two used a racial slur, talking to our lead singer, was rude, profane, very much sort of emblematic of the kind of cops you don't want in your department. And so I remember feeling a lot of anger. I do believe to this day that behind all anger is fear. So I was scared of those cops, and I didn't speak up. I didn't say anything. But I did decide, once I did become a police officer, I'm going to be a different kind of cop. I'm going to be dignified. I'm going to be respectful. I'm going to be responsive. I'm going to treat people the way I would like to be treated. And that lasted about 5 minutes. I got sucked into the police culture, which is a very strong workplace culture, regardless of the locality. And I agree with you completely, Mark, that all policing is fundamentally local. But I was amazed at how breathtakingly quick was my transition from a vaguely idealistic young man who's going to do good for the community and make my family proud of me and the like, and the point at which I started saying and doing things I'd never said or done before. So I have a cellular memory of what it means to abuse the people that I was hired to protect and serve. I've acknowledged this openly in previous books and speeches and so forth, but one of my favorite techniques was to bait people into taking a swing at me so that I could, quote, choke them out, to use the standard police sleeper hold. And I did that a lot as a rookie cop. I had my comeuppance at the hands of a principal prosecutor who in the courtroom in San Diego asked if the United States Constitution meant anything to me. I was outraged for about 3 or 4 seconds, and then I was embarrassed, and by the time I slithered down the stairs of the San Diego County Courthouse into a beautiful afternoon, I was awash in shame. What had happened to me? Who am I? Why am I behaving that way? And that was a catalytic marker moment in my life, and it did, in fact, put me on an entirely different trajectory. So throughout my career, as much as I'm interested in public safety and effective crime fighting and dignified service provision, I identified as much as a change agent, as a sergeant, a lieutenant, a captain, a chief.
Over the past, 5, 6, 7 years, the killing of unarmed black men in America by police officers has really sort of ripped the Band-Aid off of racism that has been there but has sort of percolated below the surface. I want to know, from your perspective, Norm, why so many unarmed black men are dying at the hands of police officers.
Police officers, regardless of jurisdiction, are doing what they have been taught to do. There's a tendency to think all that teaching takes place at the academy or during in-service training. Nothing could be further from the truth. The real training takes place in the front seat of a police car with a junior officer working with a senior officer. It takes place in the locker room. It takes place at squad parties and the like, where we sort of validate our attitudes and our behavior. So I think it's important first to point out that they're doing, in effect, what they've been taught to do. Some of that teaching is fatally flawed, no question about it. But we can't minimize the effect of the culture. And that senior officer saying to the junior officer, forget that nonsense that they teach in the academy, you're in the real world now, and this is how we do it. There's another factor, and if we ignore it, we ignore this first tenet of Rotary. Is it truthful? One truth about American policing is the truth about other social institutions as well, but I'll stay focused on cops and policing. And that is systemic racism is alive and well in law enforcement. Police officers are, too many white police officers are afraid of young black men. The darker the black man, the bigger the black man, the greater the fear. That's visceral, it's real. I've heard it throughout my adult life, but it's not a socially acceptable emotion, to express in the culture, in that locker room or the front seat of a police car. We can't admit that we're afraid. And if we don't come to the realization that fear is, the absence of fear, I guess, is a mental imperfection. You look at the dangers associated with police work. You're responding to a chaotic scene at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Shots have been fired, a gun was observed, that sort of thing. If you don't experience some fear in approaching that situation, there's probably something wrong with you, and you probably ought not to be a police officer. But how do we recognize that fear is an integral part of police work? How do we recognize that it's a part of our bodies? That, in fact, we all carry a cellular memory of situations that have frightened us. So the more experience we have as police officers, the greater our personal maturity, our self-confidence, the capacity to understand that fear affects my perception. I literally, if I'm scared, maybe scared to death, I don't see straight. I see a gun that's not there. I see a wallet morph in to a pistol. A TV remote becomes, a 45 automatic. I don't see straight if I'm scared beyond a certain level. And I certainly don't exercise the kind of judgment that's necessary in those chaotic and dangerous situations. So I think we have to deal with the issue of fear in the culture and recognize that it's a good and important and healthy mechanism, but that we need to learn to listen to our bodies and to understand, this is an opportunity for me to be a good cop. This is an opportunity for me not just to take the high road, but to recognize if I slow things down here. Take the John T. Williams woodcarver shooting from several years back in this city. I read the account of it. Well, that's a shame, but you don't pull a knife on a police officer. And then, of course, I saw the video. And I was shocked. It was a police officer who was out of control. It was a police officer whose fear had gotten the best of him, and a man is dead as a result. Tamir Rice, lonely 12-year-old boy on a snowy field in Cleveland, Ohio a few years ago, shot and killed by an officer who should never have been a police officer. If we want to talk about that, I think it's important. But it was fear, combined with really bad tactics. Did Michael Brown need to die on August the 9th, 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri? Absolutely not. It was a predictable death. It was a preventable death. If Darren Wilson, the officer, had not behaved the way he did, Michael Brown would be working in air conditioning and heating in his own community because he was heading off for technical school, and everybody thought he had great potential. Now, he did something wrong, but if you're a cop, you know you're going to be dealing with people who do things wrong. Does that mean they deserve to die? We need, I think, to really look at how we address this issue of fear among police officers.
And tactics.
And
Within the
tactics.
last year, I had a conversation with Sue Rahr, former King County Sheriff, who now leads the Law Enforcement Training Center in Burien. And she said, if you do the post-mortem on most of these shooting deaths, almost to a case, the officer inserts themselves into the scene so far that they only do have a few seconds or a split second to decide whether to shoot someone or not. So instead of holding back and waiting for backup, they insert themselves. And in the Michael Brown case, immediately in the guy's face, they struggle, there's shots, it's chaotic. How do we make sure that those good training tactics that they're doing in our state here, that gets replicated throughout the country so that those good practices are learned by everyone?
In my latest book, available wherever books are sold, To Protect and Serve, with a little presumptuous subtitle of How to Fix America's Police, I argue that we need to set national standards in areas of procedural justice, and I think specifically of stop and frisk, laws of arrest, rules of evidence, collection, preservation, identification of evidence. Think about those rape kits, gathering dust across the country. There are certain key areas of policing that really do demand, I think, a national standard. Timothy Lohman, the officer who shot and killed Tamir Rice in Cleveland, had been fired from the Independence, Ohio Police Department, 19 minutes away by car from Cleveland. Why was he fired? Because he fell apart on the police pistol range. He literally fell apart. He couldn't shoot straight. He was emotional. He was crying into his academy manual every night, according to his mother. He did live at home. He was somebody who might have been a nice guy, but he sure as hell shouldn't have been a police officer. But Cleveland hired him, which gets into system issues. And I think it's just vital that we understand that if you get fired from one agency for a violation of procedural justice, you ought not to be able to find a job anywhere else in the country. So I'm an advocate of certification of all police officers, the licensing of all police officers, the revocation for cause of a police officer's license. So you can't go from Ferguson to NYPD or from San Diego to Seattle or vice versa.
So given that statement, we have a Justice Department currently that has chosen to deliberately pull back from local oversight. We're just emerging from a consent decree from the Justice Department because of unconstitutional policing here in Seattle. So touch on that briefly, and then I want you to give me your assessment of where the Seattle Police Department stands today, given the reprimand, the oversight, the reform,
Sure.
and as we emerge from the consent decree.
In a couple of weeks, I'll be speaking at Seattle University. Title of the talk is Policing in the Age of Trump. And without getting too political, which is real hard for me, I would just say this. Any president of these United States who is a cheerleader for police violence ought to keep his mouth shut. This president... This president basically conveyed to police officers from border to border and coast to coast, rough them up a little bit after you arrest them before you put them in jail. He had police chiefs across the country scurrying to say, don't do what that guy said. Please don't do what he said. Here's a real problem that's going kind of unattended at the moment. Elected police officials, namely sheriffs, are in many jurisdictions echoing their president. They are, in fact, encouraging their officers to do these kinds of things. Mostly municipal police chiefs, because they report to official civic leadership. You know, the council, the mayor, the city manager, that sort of thing, are doing everything they can, I think, to do the right thing. So I really do believe that in this era, where a president makes those kinds of statements and appoints an attorney general who wants to withdraw federal support. And that's how I conceive of it. It's not some onerous responsibility on the part of the Justice Department or a local jurisdiction to get help from the federal government about setting and enforcing standards.
Briefly touch on the consent decree here in Seattle and what your assessment is of SPD today compared with pre-consent decree.
I have no illusions about policing anywhere. I think the system itself, the structure, paramilitary, bureaucratic, top-down, rigid communication systems, so on and so forth, oftentimes treating their frontline police officers like dependent or delinquent children, has got to change. And none of the reforms that I'm seeing satisfy my definition of what true reform is necessary. But I will say this, that consent decree has dramatically improved policing in the city of Seattle and in certain other cities as well. The Department of Justice investigation, its oversight, Judge Robart's monitoring basically of the consent decree has dramatically improved this police department's response, particularly in one key area, and that is de-escalation. The training is probably the best in the country now. It basically says, look, you arrive at a scene, slow things down. We've alluded to this. Slow things down. Stop shouting. Have you ever seen a YouTube of a police officer truly out of control who believes that he or she is exercising control? You know, the pitch has been elevated. The volume certainly has been elevated. The impulsiveness is written all over that action. What we need is calm, confident police officers who roll up on those scenes, size up those scenes. And by the way, what's wrong with turning tail and running? And by that, I mean going back to the back of your police car if somebody's advancing on you with an edged weapon. A baseball bat, a knife, a gun, a samurai sword, whatever it happens to be. So these police officers who have been steeped in the new tradition and been trained, developed that body of knowledge, that set of skills to actually de-escalate tense situations are saving lives. I have no doubt that there are some Seattleites who are alive today because of that training and because of the policy. I was on a panel this Saturday at Seattle University, Crosscut, happy to report. And Carmen Best was another member of that panel, and she said, We're not just training police officers in de-escalation, we have set policy for it. So if you don't use the de-escalation skills, you're in violation of Seattle Police Department's policy. That's all traceable to the consent decree, and I think has been a wonderful step forward.
I want to kind of I want to go through sort of a rapid fire list of questions just so we have a chance for those in the audience. The legislature is currently considering Initiative 940, which would change the deadly use of force law. Currently, it requires malice on the part of a police officer. It would also mandate mental health and de-escalation training. Do you support I-940?
I'm a very strong supporter of I-940, and I hope you are as well.
What about body cams? SPD is implementing those. Good idea, bad idea?
Very good idea. I used to be opposed. For a variety of reasons it would take far too much time to get into. Then I went into a sort of neutral phase for 2 or 3 years, thinking, yeah, I see the advantages, I see some significant disadvantages. Today I'm a believer.
We covered militarization of police departments. What about the war on drugs? I was up at the University of Washington recently for a story that was tied to the Department of Justice's announcement that they are not going to back off when it comes to marijuana enforcement around the country. The researchers there told me that they could not find a single case in the country of a marijuana overdose. We are killing 30 or 40,000 people a year from opioids right now. And this current Justice Department is still declaring a quote-unquote war on pot.
Well, this Justice Department, as with all previous presidential administrations and Justice Departments, has been, in some respects, important respects, anti-science, looking more at morality, looking more at gut feelings and so forth. Drugs are bad. We certainly don't want our kids exposed to drugs, so on and so forth, all of which really makes a lot of sense. At the same time, I think we need to recognize that when Richard Nixon famously proclaimed drug abuse public enemy number one and declared all-out war on them, he was declaring war on his own people. And it was a calculated and deliberate effort. If you don't believe me, please read the history on this. He, John Ehrlichman, and Bob Haldeman were in the Oval Office when it was decided to launch this drug war. That put American police officers, your city, my city, on the front lines as foot soldiers in the war on drugs, which was really a war on their own people, disproportionately young, poor, and of color. And then we wonder why there's such tension, such animosity in those neighborhoods, in those communities. Furthermore, in addition to having resulted in the incarceration of tens of millions of our fellow Americans, the drug war has cost $1.5 trillion to prosecute, and drugs are more readily available at lower prices and higher levels of potency. Is there a better example of a colossal public policy failure? Time for us, I think, to re-examine it. I propose ending the drug war, replacing prohibition, which we know from a certain experience from 1920 to 1933 in this country doesn't work, because it can't. There is just no way in the world that it can. So I'm an advocate of ending the drug war, replacing prohibition with a regulatory model which is rigorously enforced. Don't even think about driving impaired. Don't even think about furnishing to kids, regardless of what the substance is. It's not at this point, I think, in our development of social policy and drug policy reform, a very promising moment when we have the Attorney General saying that voters from this jurisdiction to that, who've already said yes to recreational as well as medical marijuana, are having those laws. Those laws are, I think, very much in danger of being overturned. And the feds coming in and co-opting local governments. I think that's a big mistake.
Let's open it up to questions now.
Here we go.
Hi there. I'm wondering if you can touch on the subject of mental health. I think that we ask a lot of our police officers, and I think here in Seattle we've seen a lot of examples where something might start out as really a mental health crisis or emergency, but through escalation leads somewhere else. So I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about that and whether there's a team approach to community health workers or mental health workers being part of the solution?
I think one of the worst things we can do as a society is put mentally ill or drug-addicted people behind bars. I think we need to recognize that police officers are being asked to confront mental illness as well as other forms of behavior that are, represent folks who are under the influence of whatever it might be. In those situations, we need very skilled, very knowledgeable police officers, and I'm a strong advocate of mental health professionals taking to the streets, teamed up with police officers. So I think jail's the worst possible response, but that's what we're doing, in police departments across the country. It's not fair to the cops, and it's certainly not fair to the community.
Thank you for being here today. If you could go back to your days when you were police chief here, and you had the benefit of all the insights and all the learnings between then and now, what would you change back in those days?
I would not have authorized the use of chemical agents against nonviolent, indeed non-threatening fellow Americans who were exercising their First Amendment rights on the streets of this city during the WTO. The absolute worst decision of my 34-year police career. So that's the one that sits at the top of the list. There are many others, but I won't bore you with them.
Chief, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
My son's 34 and goes to New York City all the time for his work. And when I went there in 1980, they told us to carry $100 in our wallet because if somebody said, give me your wallet or I'm going to kill you, we were ready. Probably the most successful turnaround in the history of police work in the United States is New York. So I moved into downtown Seattle, Lower Queen Anne 4.5 years ago. How many police officers are there in the city limits of Seattle today compared to 30 years ago, number one? And how much triage are those police officers being forced to do, not enforcing people running red lights, jaywalking and putting themselves in harm's way, living on the sidewalk, et cetera, that's not being enforced because of that?
The short answer to your question about relative staffing levels between 30 years ago and today, roughly the same. And one of the things we need to recognize is that when you look at the total number of police officers for a given city, you have to start a subtraction process. Those who are not on duty today because they're on days off, or on vacation, or on military leave, those who are assigned to investigations versus patrol, so on and so forth. So that question of how many cops is enough cops is a question that the entire community needs to answer. In fact, I would go one step further. New York's turnaround is truly phenomenal. It was extraordinary. It was at some cost to the community-police relationship, particularly with respect to stop and frisk. And a federal judge, I think quite appropriately, called the New York Police Department to account for harassment, for taking the broken windows theory to an extreme. That being, take care of small problems, big problems will take care of themselves. I am a very, very strong advocate of, where's Ken, of massive change in policing, where citizens, so you'll have to deal with the after effects of this. I envision and I advocate a massive grassroots campaign to merge Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter, to get people who don't even talk to one another unless they're screaming at each other to come together to recognize the common good, to recognize the tenets of Rotary, for example, which I find very inspiring and always have, to appreciate the fact that if citizens and police combine in authentic partnership, you put an end to the arbitrary unilateral decision-making on the part of the government. The police in America belong to the people, not the other way around. So I envision a partnership, and that really requires expansion, and I'm sorry we don't have enough time for it.
I read an interview where you said you want to see the civil rights model applied to policing in America, and that is it started with people like Rosa Parks, and it grew, and it grew, and it grew, and everyone realized at the local level they needed to do something.
You mentioned Rosa Parks. I had the deep, deep honor of meeting her in San Diego. The Black Police Officers Association found out that she was going to be in town, and they went directly to her and her people and said, "Will you come to one of our meetings?" And she did. It was a truly extraordinary experience. Yes, I'm a strong advocate of the civil rights model. That was grassroots community organizing, aided by law, aided by Supreme Court decisions, aided by those police officers in certain jurisdictions who recognize that they're a part of and not apart from the community. And so what we had was this wonderful coalition of people marching across that bridge, for example, in Alabama. I think it's vital that we recognize the power of community in achieving public safety on our streets and an honoring of human rights and civil liberties of all of us.
Please help me in thanking Norm Stamper. Norm, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.